Welcome back to Dark Domain, where the line between reality and terror blurs. Tonight we're diving into tales from Halloween, a time when the strange and unexplained creep out from the shadows. These aren't your average ghost stories. Each tale holds a dark twist that'll make you rethink your plans for the spookiest night of the year. From a cursed costume to a house that appears only to some, and a pumpkin with a thirst for revenge, these stories will stay with you long after the last candle flickers out. Grab a blanket, turn off the lights, and let's step into the realm where Halloween fears become hauntingly real. The Carved Curse. Growing up in a small town, Halloween was practically sacred. Every year, kids from all over would flock to Jacob's farm for the annual Pumpkin Patch Festival. Jacob, an old farmer with a perpetually grim expression, set up an elaborate display of scarecrows, hay bales, and pumpkins of all shapes and sizes. But what really set his farm apart was the legend of the Carved Curse. Everyone in town knew the story. Supposedly, if you carved a pumpkin from Jacob's patch on Halloween night and left it outside overnight, something bad would happen to you. Most people brushed it off as an old wives' tale, a harmless bit of fun to add to the Halloween spirit. But every year there were whispers about strange occurrences. People claiming to have seen shadowy figures in their windows, unexplained scratches on doors, or worse. Still, the warnings didn't stop people from picking out their pumpkins. This Halloween, my friend Mike and I decided to head over to Jacob's farm. We weren't superstitious, and honestly, we thought the Carved Curse was a gimmick to attract visitors. But when we got to the farm, there was something off about the place. The air felt colder, the scarecrows seemed more sinister, and Jacob himself barely acknowledged us as he handed us 2 pumpkins with a strange glint in his eye. We didn't think much of it and went back to Mike's place to carve them. We spent hours creating the most grotesque faces we could think of. Twisted mouths, jagged teeth, and hollow eyes. We laughed about the curse, daring each other to leave our pumpkins outside that night. Eventually, we agreed to test the legend, convinced it would amount to nothing more than a funny story to tell later. I left my pumpkin outside on Mike's porch, its twisted face staring into the street. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something strange. The street was empty, but the shadows seemed wrong. They were too long, stretching unnaturally as if trying to pull themselves closer to the house. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just getting into my own head. We went to bed a little after midnight, but around 3 a.m. I woke up to a strange noise coming from outside, like something scraping against the pavement. I brushed it off as a stray animal or the wind and tried to go back to sleep. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like something heavy was being dragged. Unable to ignore it any longer, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the window. The sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. My pumpkin was gone. In its place was a faint trail of dirt, leading away from the porch and down the road. I nudged Mike awake, barely able to contain my panic, and together, we followed the trail. The path led us down empty streets, past darkened houses, and toward the edge of town. The dirt trail ended at Jacob's farm. There in the middle of the field were dozens of pumpkins, all arranged in a perfect circle, but they weren't the same ones we'd seen earlier in the day. These pumpkins had faces, some familiar, others grotesque and twisted, each one staring out with hollow eyes and wide, unnatural grins. Then we saw them, our pumpkins, right in the center of the circle. They had moved on their own, or something had moved them. But the faces were different. The expressions we'd carved were now warped, twisted in fear. It was as if our own pumpkins were staring back at us, warning us to leave. Mike whispered, "Let's get out of here." But just as we turned to leave, we heard a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The air grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. I glanced back at the circle, and that's when I saw them. Shadowy figures began emerging from behind the pumpkins. Mike grabbed my arm, yanking me backward, and we bolted, stumbling through the field and back to the road. But no matter how fast we ran, I could feel them behind us, their presence a cold weight on my back. We didn't stop until we reached his house, slamming the door behind us and locking every possible entry. We barely slept that night, too shaken to close our eyes, fearing what we might see if we did. In the morning, I peeked outside. Our pumpkins were back on the porch, but they looked different. The grins were wider, the eyes deeper, almost mocking us. It was as if they were saying, "We'll be back." For days after, strange things happened. I found dirt on my doorstep, footprints that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Mike started hearing whispers outside his window, faint but insistent, like something was trying to lure him outside. We decided to confront Jacob, hoping he could shed some light on the situation. When we got to the farm, he was there, tending to his pumpkins with the same grim expression he always wore. "We know about the curse," I blurted out, desperate for answers. "We left our pumpkins out, and now things are happening." Jacob looked up, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You boys thought it was just a story, didn't you?" We nodded, embarrassed but terrified. He sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. "That curse isn't for show. It's a warning. Those pumpkins, they belong to something ancient, something that needs a face to walk in our world, even if just for a night." "What do you mean?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. Jacob's gaze hardened. "Next time, don't go messing with things you don't understand." He turned and walked away, leaving us in stunned silence. We went home, resolved to never touch a pumpkin from Jacob's farm again. But every Halloween since, strange things have happened. I see shadows at the edge of my vision, hear whispers when I'm alone, and sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of a twisted, grinning face in my window, my pumpkin, still watching, waiting for the chance to return. The costume that wasn't there. Halloween was always a big deal in our little town. Every October, the main street transformed into a creepy carnival, complete with haunted houses, costume contests, and dozens of decorated booths run by locals. I'd been going for years, always bringing my best costumes, hoping to win the elusive first-place trophy. But last year, something happened that has me wondering if I'll ever go back. The night started like any other Halloween. I dressed up as a plague doctor, complete with a long black cloak and a handmade mask. As I walked through the carnival, kids and adults alike pointed and whispered about the creepy doctor. I loved it. The atmosphere was electric, crisp autumn air, glowing jack-o'-lanterns, and the smell of caramel apples and popcorn. It was while walking past the haunted alley, a narrow corridor strung with fake spider webs and flickering purple lights, that I first saw him. He wore a costume similar to mine, but his cloak looked worn, tattered, like it had seen many years of use. His mask was different too, more bird-like and sinister, with feathers along the edges and red lenses over the eyes that gave him a chilling stare. He just stood there, completely still, as if waiting for something. I tried to brush it off as someone getting into character, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, not moving, just watching me. It was unnerving. Halloween was for jump scares and cheap thrills, but this felt different. There was an intensity to his gaze that sent a chill down my spine. As I continued through the crowd, I lost track of him for a while. But each time I entered a new area, the candy booth, the haunted hayride, the fortune teller's tent, I'd catch a glimpse of him standing at the edge of the crowd. He never moved, never interacted with anyone else. Just stood there, always facing me. I tried shaking off the feeling of being watched by heading to the House of Horrors, an old theater repurposed for Halloween with dim lights and eerie sound effects echoing through the halls. I hoped that stepping inside would put some distance between me and my masked twin. But no sooner had I taken a few steps into the darkened maze of horror movie scenes when I felt it, a faint presence, just a few feet behind me. I turned around, my pulse quickening. He was there again, this time close enough that I could see the glint of his red lenses in the dim light. "Nice costume," I said, trying to sound unfazed. He didn't respond, just stood there, his head tilted slightly as if studying me. I backed away, trying to lose him in the twists and turns of the maze. The air felt thicker the further I went, the walls closing in as eerie whispers floated through the speakers. Finally, I ducked into a small alcove, hoping he'd pass by without noticing me. I peeked out, holding my breath. Then, something strange happened. I saw him walk right by me, but instead of the stilted walk I'd expected from a Halloween character, he moved smoothly, like he was gliding. I'd seen actors and staff walking around all night, but none of them had that level of silent control. It was unnatural. I waited until he disappeared around a corner before making my way back to the exit. By then, I was sure he wasn't just another visitor. There was something wrong with him, something I couldn't explain. I needed to leave. But as I reached the theater doors, I saw him standing there, blocking my way. This time he was closer, close enough that I could hear his slow, deliberate breathing through the mask. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered, his voice low and distorted, like it was being played through an old radio. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I fumbled for an explanation. I'm just here for the festival." "No," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "You're in my domain now. The dark domain." I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I bolted through a side exit, running down the street and not stopping until I reached a well-lit part of town. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze, like he was right behind me watching. When I finally reached my house, I locked every door and window, drawing the blinds for good measure. My heart was still racing, and my hands trembled as I tried to calm myself. I told myself it was just an elaborate prank, someone taking Halloween a bit too seriously. But a part of me knew better. The next morning, I decided to go back to the carnival site, hoping to get some answers. I went to the booth run by the local historical society, where they often had old costumes on display. I figured if anyone knew who the mysterious plague doctor was, it would be them. But when I described the costume to the lady at the booth, she gave me a strange look. "We haven't used that costume in years. It was from an old exhibit, part of the town's history." "What do you mean, history?" I asked, my voice a whisper. She hesitated, looking over her shoulder before leaning in. "Back in the 1800s, there was a plague that swept through this area. A doctor came through town, dressed just like that. Black cloak, bird mask, everything. They say he never left. Some claim his spirit still roams during Halloween, looking for those who enter his domain uninvited." I felt a chill run down my spine. Could it really have been him? I wanted to believe it was just a story, something to scare tourists. But then she added, almost as an afterthought, "The weirdest part. People who encounter him say he only shows up to those dressed like him, as if he's seeking out someone to take his place." I left the booth, my mind spinning. It sounded absurd, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth to her words. I'd dressed as a plague doctor to win a Halloween costume contest, but I'd ended up with something far more sinister. Now every Halloween I avoid the main street carnival. I still see people dressed in similar costumes wandering the town, but each time I spot one, I wonder, could it be him? Could he still be looking for someone to replace him? Or worse, was he waiting for me to return? The house that hides. I've always had a fascination with the eerie and the unexplained, so when I heard about an abandoned house at the edge of town that locals swore was haunted, I couldn't resist. There were plenty of rumors, strange shadows, lights flickering at night, even whispers from empty rooms. But the most intriguing part, the house supposedly didn't appear to everyone. Some people could walk down that street 100 times and never see it. Only those meant to find it ever did. I couldn't let a story like that pass me by. Halloween night seemed like the perfect time for a visit. Armed with only my phone, I walked through the old neighborhood, the houses growing darker and more decrepit the closer I got. The streets were empty, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the chilly autumn wind. I started doubting the tales. Maybe it was just a myth, a local legend to keep kids entertained. But then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it. The house stood back from the road, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes and an ancient wrought iron fence. It was a tall, Victorian-style mansion, its paint chipped and windows clouded with years of dust. Despite its abandoned state, a faint light glowed in the upstairs window. My heart raced with excitement and fear. I'd found it. As I approached, the gate creaked open with an unsettling ease, like it was inviting me in. The yard was full of dead leaves, and I noticed with a shiver that there were no other sounds. No crickets, no rustling branches. Just an unsettling silence. The front door was slightly ajar, almost beckoning. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the cracked windows, and every step echoed in the silence. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and old furniture sat draped in sheets, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. I held my phone's flashlight in front of me, feeling more and more like an intruder. The first floor was quiet, too quiet. As I walked through what must have been the parlor, I felt the temperature drop sharply. My breath fogged in the air, and I shivered, pulling my jacket closer. That's when I heard it, a faint sound like whispering coming from upstairs. Common sense told me to turn around and leave, but curiosity pulled me forward. I climbed the creaky, spiraling staircase, each step louder than the last. The whispers grew clearer, although I couldn't make out any words. They had an oddly rhythmic quality, almost like chanting. My heart pounded as I reached the landing and turned toward the room with the glowing light. The door was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I nudged it open and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the whispers stopped the instant I entered. The only light in the room came from a flickering candle on a small table. Next to it was an old, faded photograph in a wooden frame. I stepped closer, and my blood ran cold. The photo was of a group of people standing in front of the very house I was in. But what made my skin crawl was that one of the people in the photo looked exactly like me. Same hair, same build, even the same jacket I was wearing. The photo looked old, faded at the edges, like it had been taken decades ago. I stumbled back, my mind racing for explanations. Maybe it was just someone who looked like me, some trick of the mind. But as I stared at the picture, something changed. I could swear the figure's eyes were moving, tracking me. I shook my head, telling myself I was just seeing things. But when I looked back at the photograph, there was no mistaking it. The eyes were definitely watching me. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out, grateful for the distraction. But when I glanced at the screen, a chill shot down my spine. My camera app had opened on its own, and a message flashed across the screen. Welcome home. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the house as I bolted down the stairs. But the front door, which had been ajar when I arrived, was now shut tight. I yanked on the handle, my heart pounding, but it wouldn't budge. Panicking, I looked around for another way out, and that's when I saw something that froze me in place. All around the room, covering the walls, were more photographs. Each one was of a different person, but they all had the same look of terror on their faces. And then I realized, with a sinking feeling, that they were all taken in this very house. In the corners of the photos, I noticed shadows, dark, twisted shapes that seemed to be reaching toward the people in the pictures. Desperate, I backed away, searching for any escape. That's when I heard a voice, barely a whisper, coming from right behind me.
You shouldn't have come here.
I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the empty house and those photographs staring back at me. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a photo of me. Standing there in the hall, my face pale with fear as though someone had taken the picture just moments before. The chanting started again, louder now, and I could feel something closing in on me, an oppressive force that seemed to fill the air with a crushing weight. I bolted down the hallway, searching for any way out, and finally spotted a window near the back of the house. I didn't think twice. I hurled myself at it, smashing through the glass and landing hard on the ground outside. Dazed and bleeding, I stumbled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I was far from the house. When I finally looked back, it was gone. The entire house had disappeared, leaving nothing but an empty lot, as though it had never been there. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house or why it chose me. But every Halloween since, I've received a photograph in the mail. A photo of me, standing in front of the house that doesn't exist, with shadows creeping ever closer each year. Well, you survived, for now. Thanks for joining us here on Dark Domain, where Halloween isn't just a date on the calendar. It's a reminder that some things are better left unexplored. If you enjoyed the stories tonight, don't forget to hit that like button, unless you want one of these cursed pumpkins showing up at your door. And hey, if you're brave enough, drop a comment with your own Halloween horrors, or let us know if you dare to visit Jacob's farm or the house that hides. And of course, make sure to subscribe, because once you step into the dark domain, there's no turning back. Sleep well, if you can.